Never trust someone who suddenly becomes interested in your money. Julia woke up to find her house on fire, the doors locked from the outside, and her husband was nowhere to be found. This is the story of how a 5-year-old girl and a dead grandmother saved her life. Julia Bennett thought she knew her husband. They had been married for 7 years, raised a beautiful daughter together, and built what looked like a perfect life in Portland, Maine. But when Julia's mother passed away and left her a large inheritance, everything changed. The man she trusted most in the world was about to show her who he really was. And if it wasn't for her daughter Lily and some eerie warnings from beyond the grave, Julia wouldn't be alive to tell this story. Julia's life seemed ordinary. She was a wife, a mother, and someone who believed in the goodness of people. Her husband Mark worked in sales, and while their relationship wasn't perfect, it was stable. They had their daughter Lily, who was 5 years old at the time, bright and curious with a wild imagination that sometimes worried Julia. Mark's mother, Margaret, had always been part of their lives. But calling her involved would be an understatement. Margaret was controlling. She criticized how Julia dressed, how she cooked, how she raised Lily. Nothing Julia did was ever good enough for her mother-in-law. But Mark never stood up for his wife. He would just shrug it off and say that's how his mother was, that Julia needed to be more understanding. Julia's own mother was the complete opposite. Warm, supportive, the kind of woman who made you feel safe just by being in the room. When she got sick, Julia spent every moment she could at her bedside. The cancer took her quickly, and Julia was devastated. But her mother had been smart with her money. She left Julia an inheritance that was substantial, around $400,000. At first, Mark seemed supportive. He held Julia when she cried, told her everything would be okay. But within weeks, something shifted. He started taking phone calls late at night, stepping outside or going into the garage. When Julia asked who he was talking to, he would get defensive, saying it was work or his mother checking in. Margaret's visits became more frequent. She would show up unannounced, walking into their home like she owned it. She would spend hours with Lily, teaching her things, playing games, but always with this edge of control. Lily had to sit a certain way, speak a certain way, behave exactly as Margaret wanted. If she didn't, Margaret would give her these cold looks that made even Julia uncomfortable. Julia started noticing other changes too. Mark was always on his phone, texting someone and quickly putting it away when she entered the room. He became distant, less affectionate. When Julia tried to talk about their finances, about maybe investing some of the inheritance or paying off their mortgage, Mark would shut down the conversation. He said he would handle it, that she shouldn't worry about money. But Julia did worry. Something felt wrong. The way Mark looked at her sometimes, like he was calculating something. The way Margaret would smile when she thought Julia wasn't looking. There was a coldness in their eyes that Julia couldn't shake. Then Lily started saying strange things. One afternoon, while Julia was making lunch, Lily looked up from her coloring book and said that Grandma was still here. Julia's heart squeezed. She knelt down and gently explained that Grandma had passed away, that she was in heaven now. But Lily shook her head insistently. She said no, not that Grandma. The other Grandma. Grandma was talking to her. Julia assumed Lily meant Margaret. But when she asked if Grandma Margaret had visited, Lily got this confused look on her face. She said no, her real grandma, Mommy's mommy. She said Grandma was worried about them and that they needed to be careful. Children have wild imaginations. Julia knew this. She had read all the parenting books about how kids process grief, how they sometimes create imaginary friends or see deceased loved ones as a way to cope. So Julia didn't push it. She just held Lily close and told her everything was going to be okay. But the incidents didn't stop. Lily would mention things, little comments here and there, that made Julia's skin crawl. One night at dinner, Lily suddenly said that Daddy and Grandma Margaret were making plans. When Julia asked what kind of plans, Lily just shrugged and said she didn't know, but Grandma told her to stay close to Mommy. Mark overheard and laughed it off. He said Lily had quite the imagination and maybe they should limit her screen time. But Julia saw something flash across his face, just for a second. It looked like fear. Julia started paying closer attention. She noticed that Margaret only came over when Mark was home. They would huddle together in the kitchen or out on the porch, speaking in low voices. When Julia approached, they would quickly change the subject or Margaret would suddenly need to leave. One evening, Julia couldn't sleep. She got up for some water and heard Mark's voice coming from the garage. She crept closer and pressed her ear to the door. She heard him say something that made her blood run cold. She won't see it coming. Just a few more weeks and everything will be ours. Julia's mind raced. What wouldn't she see coming? What would be theirs? She wanted to burst through that door and demand answers, but something stopped her. Fear, maybe. Or instinct telling her that confronting him would be dangerous. The next day, while Mark was at work and Lily was at kindergarten, Julia did something she never thought she would do. She went through Mark's things. His office desk, his filing cabinet, the boxes in the garage. She felt guilty, like she was betraying their marriage. But that guilt evaporated when she found the folder hidden beneath a stack of old tax returns. Inside was a life insurance policy. On her. For $1 million. Mark was listed as the sole beneficiary. The policy had been taken out just 3 weeks after her mother's funeral. Julia's hands shook as she read the documents. There were other papers too, bank statements showing Mark had been moving money around, and a burner phone she had never seen before. Julia felt like she was going to be sick. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't grief making her imagine things. Her husband was planning something, and it involved her death. She took photos of everything with her phone and put the folder back exactly as she found it. She needed proof, but she also needed to be smart. If Mark suspected she knew, there was no telling what he might do. Julia called her best friend Sarah, but kept it vague, saying she just needed someone to talk to. Sarah sensed something was wrong and invited Julia and Lily to stay with her for a few days. But Mark shot down the idea. He said Julia was being dramatic, that she needed to stay home and rest. He was being extra attentive now, almost suffocating. He would ask where she was going, who she was talking to. Julia felt trapped in her own home. Lily's warnings became more specific. She told Julia that Grandma said there would be fire, that they needed to have a plan. Julia's rational mind kept trying to dismiss it, but the mother in her was terrified. She started keeping her car keys and phone on her at all times. She made sure Lily knew how to call for help. Then came the night that almost ended everything. Julia had gone to bed early, exhausted from the constant anxiety. Mark said he was going to stay up and watch a game. Around 2 in the morning, Julia woke up coughing. There was a smell in the air, sharp and chemical. Her eyes stung. She sat up and immediately saw the orange glow coming from under the bedroom door. Smoke was filling the room. Julia jumped out of bed and ran to the door, but it wouldn't open. It was locked from the outside. Panic seized her. She ran to the window and tried to open it, but it had been sealed shut. The smoke was getting thicker. Julia screamed for Mark, for anyone. She ran to Lily's room, which was connected to hers through a bathroom. Lily was awake, sitting up in bed, completely calm. She said Grandma told her this would happen and that they needed to go now. Julia wanted to ask how a door could be locked from the outside, how windows could be sealed without her noticing, but there was no time. Flames were visible now, crawling up the hallway walls. The heat was intense. Julia grabbed Lily and tried every door, every window. They were trapped. But, but Lily pulled on her mother's hand. She said Grandma showed her a special door. Julia was confused, terrified, barely able to think through the smoke filling her lungs. Lily led her to the back of her closet. Behind the hanging clothes was a small panel that Julia had always assumed was just part of the wall. Lily pushed on it and it swung open. Behind it was a narrow passage, dusty and dark. Julia had no idea it existed. The house was old, built in the early 1900s, and apparently, it had secrets. They crawled through the passage, Julia pushing Lily ahead of her, both of them coughing and crying. The passage led to what used to be a servant's staircase, long since closed off during renovations. It opened into the old garden shed at the back of the property. They tumbled out into the cold night air, gasping and shaking. Julia looked back at her house. Flames were shooting from the windows now, consuming everything. She grabbed Lily and ran to the neighbor's house, pounding on the door until they answered. The fire department came. The police came. Julia told them everything, about the life insurance policy, about Mark's strange behavior, about how the doors had been locked. The police found Mark standing across the street, watching the house burn. He tried to act shocked when he saw Julia and Lily alive, but Julia saw the truth in his eyes. He had expected them to die. The investigation moved quickly. Firefighters found evidence of arson. Gasoline had been poured throughout the house. The security system had been deliberately disabled. The doors had been locked with padlocks on the outside, and the windows had been nailed shut. Mark had been methodical. When police searched Mark's car, they found the burner phone Julia had photographed. Text messages between Mark and Margaret laid out the entire plan. They had been plotting Julia's death for months, ever since learning about the inheritance. Margaret had convinced her son that Julia didn't deserve the money, that it should go to family, meaning Mark and eventually Lily, who Margaret planned to raise herself. They had considered making it look like an accident, maybe a fall down the stairs or a car crash. But Mark worried there would be too many questions. Fire was cleaner, they thought. A tragic accident. A young mother and daughter lost in a house fire. Mark would be the grieving widow, collecting the life insurance and the inheritance. Margaret was arrested at her home. Both she and Mark tried to blame each other. Margaret claimed Mark had acted alone, that she had only been venting her frustrations about Julia and hadn't meant for anyone to get hurt. Mark claimed his mother had manipulated him, pushed him into it. But the text messages told a different story. They had been willing participants, both of them. At trial, Lily testified. She was only 5 years old, but she spoke clearly about the things she had overheard, about Daddy and Grandma Margaret talking about fire and money. She talked about her other grandma, the one who had passed away, who she said had warned her and helped her find the secret door. The prosecutor didn't put much weight on the supernatural elements of Lily's testimony, but the facts were undeniable. Julia and Lily had escaped through a passage that Mark didn't even know existed. Whether it was a child's intuition, blind luck, or something beyond explanation, it had saved their lives. Mark was sentenced to 15 years for attempted murder and arson. Margaret received 8 years for conspiracy and aiding in the crime. Neither showed remorse. Even at sentencing, Margaret glared at Julia like this was somehow all her fault. Julia and Lily moved to a small cottage on the other side of Portland. Julia used part of her inheritance to found the Second Light Foundation, a nonprofit supporting young women artists who had experienced trauma. She wanted to turn her pain into something meaningful, to help others find their light after darkness. Lily started therapy to process what she had been through. She still talked about her grandmother sometimes, about how she had protected them. Julia didn't discourage it anymore. Whether it was real or a coping mechanism, it had saved them, and that was what mattered. The house was a total loss, burned to the foundation. But standing in front of it weeks later, Julia didn't feel sad. She felt free. That house had been a trap, filled with lies and danger. Walking away from its ashes, she and Lily were finally safe. Julia's story is a reminder that the people closest to us can sometimes be the most dangerous. Mark had shared her bed, raised a child with her, made promises of forever. Margaret had been family through marriage. And yet both had been willing to murder her for money. But it's also a story of survival and a mother's love. Julia had trusted her instincts when something felt wrong. She had protected her daughter even when she didn't fully understand the danger. And Lily, whether guided by her grandmother's spirit or her own incredible intuition, had known what to do when the moment came. Today, Julia and Lily are rebuilding their lives. The trauma will always be part of their story, but it doesn't define them. They have each other, they have their safety, and they have a future that Mark and Margaret tried to steal. From the ashes of betrayal, they rose stronger, proving that even in the darkest fire, love can light the way to safety. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button.